So every time I do a music appreciation presentation, there is always the two things happen. First of all, I end up going through all kinds of wonderful rabbit holes when I'm trying to do my research. And invariably, there are songs for any given presentation that end up in the cutting room floor just because we don't have time to present everything. And for the last one, which had to do with Bossa-Nova, there were a few songs that I would have loved to talk about, but there was simply not enough time. We started by saying that João Gilberto is considered one of the two founders of the Bossa Nova movement next to Antonio Carlos Jobim, and that it all started with Gilberto's debut album, which was released in July 10, 1959. And we also wrapped up our presentation mentioning how he spent his latter years touring with just his guitar before passing in 2019, one day short of his debut album release anniversary, which was 61 years prior. Now, in 2000, João Gilberto released an album that featured him playing acoustic guitar. After a decade of not recording very much, I remember discovering this album at Tower Records in Boston, when you would go into the famous record store, wear headphones at headphone stations, and try to shop for music that you were not familiar with. And I heard the album, and I immediately fell in love with his very, very central, very quiet voice and just the guitar accompaniment. And one of the songs caught my attention because he sang it in Spanish. It was called Eclipse, which of course means eclipse. And the song was composed by Margarita Lecuona, a Cuban mezzo-soprano singer and songwriter responsible for composing more than 300 songs, including Babalu, which was made famous by Desi Arnaz, who later on went on to play Lucy's husband in her television show, I Love Lucy. But I digress. She composed more than 300 songs. Eclipse is a bolero, which is a genre of song that originated in Cuba in the 19th century and quickly became quite popular in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. We don't know when the song was composed, but there is a version of her singing her own song on YouTube, which was digitized from an old 78 RPM record, and 78 RPM records were discontinued in the late 60s, so the recording was probably from the first half of the 20th century. We also don't know when João Gilberto became acquainted with the song, but he featured it in a 1970 LP that he recorded in Mexico after his landmark recording with Stan Getz in the United States. In the liner notes for that album, João Gilberto mentioned that he had come to Mexico for a few days in 1970 for the World Soccer Cup. And he ended up staying in Mexico for a few years. So he recorded a few beautiful songs composed by Mexican composers, including Bésame Mucho. But in that album, he included Eclipse. And before I tell you what the lyrics are about, and that's the whole point of this little conversation, is I want to ask you a question. Do you know those times in which you are not sure if the other person loves you anymore? Or maybe you've had a disagreement and you're feeling at odds, or maybe the whole thing is over. But the bottom line is you are not sure if your love is being reciprocated. Well, that is what Eclipse, the song, is about. And I would love to show you the lyrics, tell you the lyrics, and then translate them. So the first verse, there are 3 verses in total. The first verse says, Eclipse de luna en el cielo, ausencia de luz en el mar, sufriendo de amargo desvelo, mirando la luna, me puse a llorar. And that translates to eclipse of the moon in the sky, absence of light in the sea, suffering from bitter sleeplessness, and looking at the moon, I started to cry. The second verse says, pensaba que ya no me amabas con honda desesperación, y es algo que siempre eclipsaba la luz de tu amor. I thought you no longer loved me with deep desperation, and it's something that has always eclipsed the light of your love. And then the first verse is repeated, and then the third verse says, Eclipse de amor en tus labios que ya no me quieren besar, quisiera olvidar mis agravios y luego soñar. And that translates to eclipse of love on your lips that no longer want to kiss me. I wish to forget my grievances, and then I wish to dream. Denial, my friends, denial. I will share links to the composer's version on YouTube, and I will share a Spotify link to João Gilberto's 2000 version, which is still my favorite. And also, not surprisingly, I found out in my research that Mexico's Natalia Lafourcade has also rescued the song and recorded it in the last few years. And I'll share a link to all of that as well. And this is just a little gift from the music editing room. As you know, our next music appreciation lecture will have to do with music plagiarism, and I'm already deep in the rabbit hole for that.